hope everyone had a good Thanksgiving day and enjoyed time with friends and family. This Sabbath, I would like to share with you about God's providence. And it's something that we see in the book of Ruth. I don't know how many of you have read through the book of Ruth. It's a small book in the Bible, so it's a easy read to just go through the whole story. But it's not always easy to understand God's providence, how it works, and to be able to see the evidence of God's providence. It's usually easier to see it in retrospect as we look back, and it's not always easy to see it right there in the moment. It's like an artist painting upon the canvas. You don't know what he's painting, but at the end, if you come at the beginning, you might just see a bunch of different colors, but you don't see there's not maybe a distinct pattern, that you don't know what the end is going to be. But when you come back and you see the finished product, then it's evident, wow, there was a plan. This artist had something in mind. And the same could be said about God's providence in our life. So before we get into the story of the book of Ruth, I just want to share a little bit of the background of this book. We don't know who wrote the book of Ruth, but Jewish tradition attributes it to Samuel. And though Samuel never saw the reign of King David, he did anoint him by the command of God, so he did know that David was the chosen one to be king. So there is some evidence to suggest that the prophet Samuel possibly wrote this book. Great persons such as Moses, even Samuel himself, they have birth narratives. So there's stories that give us information about their background and their birth. And the book of Ruth provides the birth narrative to David's ancestors during Israel's darkest hour. If you open your Bibles to the book of Ruth, verse 1 informs us of the time and place of this story. Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, "Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons." So this first verse tells us where the story takes place. There's a man from Bethlehem, and there's famine, and so he leaves to Moab. It's interesting to take note of this. The location of Bethlehem is interesting because the meaning of Bethlehem is house of bread. And there is famine. There's no bread in the house of bread. It's ironic. We are also given the historic time frame. It's when the judges ruled. Now, if you've ever read through the book of Judges, you probably noted that it wasn't an easy time for Israel. It had a lot of ups and downs, and as one of the phrases that is repeated in the book, which highlights a theme of the book, in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So it was a really rocky period for Israel. And for all of us here, when we read about Bethlehem, Bethlehem has very positive connotations for us. We think of King David, we think of Jesus. But if you were living closer to the time, let's say, of David and Samuel, and you had the book of Judges and you read through the book of Judges, Bethlehem there are some stories in the book of Judges that don't paint a very nice picture of Bethlehem. The two last stories, which the book of Judges closes with, have links with Bethlehem. The first is of an idolatrous Levite who he's made a priest, and they set up a false system of worship where there's syncretism. They're still worshiping the true God, but they're mixing in a number of pagan practices into this. And there was a Levite. He was from Bethlehem, Judah, and he's just wandering around looking for a place, looking for a better occupation. And he finds a man who was just looking for a priest and hires him, and he says yes. And then later on, the tribe of Dan comes by, and they learn that there's a priest, that this man has this priest there, and so they ended up kind of stealing him, even though the Levite was happy to go with them. He said, hey, they told him, hey, why are you just going to be a priest to this man's home and family where you could be a priest to the whole tribe of Dan? And he said, sounds like a good plan. I'm ready for a promotion. And he goes along with it. But, the story is there to highlight the religious decay in the nation. There was this spiritual downturn during the time of the Judges. And then the last story in the book of Judges tells us about another Levite. And remember, the Levites are the religious leaders. The priests were from the tribe of Levi. And all the other Levites, they were supported by the people, and they were supposed to be the teachers. They were supposed to be the guardians of the people's spirituality. And the last story in the book of Judges tells us about another Levite, and a very cold-hearted Levite, and it's a very tragic story. But he takes a concubine from Bethlehem. So up to that point, Bethlehem didn't have very good associations, but the book of Ruth is going to start changing this negative association with Bethlehem. The book takes its name from one of the main characters, Ruth. She's the heroine of the narrative, and Ruth is truly a virtuous woman. Now, our Bibles, the way that it's organized, I believe it's taken from how the Septuagint was organized, but in some of the Hebrew Bibles, they had a different organizational structure for the different books of the Bible, and in some Hebrew Bibles, the book of Ruth comes right after the book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs ends talking about a virtuous woman, and the book of Ruth comes right after Proverbs, and it tells us, and it gives us a nice picture of a virtuous woman. Many Old Testament theologians emphasize the theme of God's providence in the book of Ruth. The narrative illustrates how God works behind the scenes in a very hidden way. God is there, God is present, God is working, but he's not so visible. And what we see, I believe what we see in the book of Ruth is true, not just for Ruth and Naomi and Boaz, the main characters of the book, but I believe it's true in our own lives. You see, there are times where we see evident miracles of God working in very miraculous ways, but the majority of most people's lives, God is still present, but his providence is working in a very hidden way, in a natural way. He's there, but not always so tangible. And this is why I believe the Apostle Paul said, we walk by faith and not by sight. So with this background in mind, let's jump into the story. I'm going to start in chapter 1, verse 1 again, and I'm going to read all the way to verse 5. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they came into the country of Moab and continued there. And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left, and her 2 sons. And they took them wives of the women of Moab, and the name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelled there about 10 years. And Mahlon and Chilion died also, both of them. And the woman was left of her 2 sons and her husband. So the book starts off in a very tragic tone. Not only is there famine, which leads this family to leave Bethlehem and go into one of the neighboring countries, which was the Moabites were pagans, and often they became enemies of the Israelites. So, but apparently Elimelech saw brighter hopes in the future, them being in Moab than them staying there in Bethlehem. And things just really go south for the family. The father dies, and then the 2 sons die. You could try to empathize with Naomi's situation and really feel her pain. In the first part of the story, God seems absent. God seems, and this, I think this is true for most of us as human beings, when we are struck by, when we receive a blow of death in the family, especially from someone so close, it can lead us to think that God is not there, or that God doesn't care anymore about us. The silence of God brings pain, but this silence is not a sign of God's absence. And we're going to see that even there is evidence of God's providence and God's hand working in the life of Naomi. Naomi receives word in verse 6 that she hears, she's still in the country of Moab, and she hears how that the Lord visited his people in giving them bread. Once again, in Bethlehem, the house of bread, there is bread. So here's the first indication of God's providence. When Naomi, there in this foreign land, when her husband, after her 2 sons die, now she hears word that God has visited his people. God has visited his people and blessed with bread. And this now motivates Naomi to go back to her home country. So she does this. And as she's on her way, she looks at her 2 daughters-in-laws and she tries to persuade them to just stay. She tries to persuade them to stay, to go back to their families. And you can see her focus is not on herself. Naomi was a very selfless person. And even in the midst of great pain, she's not thinking about herself. She's thinking about her daughter-in-laws. And she says in verse 8 and 9, and Naomi said unto her 2 daughters-in-law, Go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as ye have dealt with the dead and with me. And the Lord grant you that ye may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them and lifted up their voice and wept. So here we see something very important. We see Naomi's faith in God and her assimilation of God's character in her life. She commends her daughter-in-laws to God's kind providence by telling them, "The Lord deal kindly with you." The Hebrew term there is hesed. And it's used several times in the story to designate an essential characteristic of God. It refers to God's gracious, merciful, and faithful commitment to humans. It's divine concern for the needs of others. And as you see, as human beings embody this characteristic of God, his loving kindness towards others who are in need, we're going to see throughout this story that those who possess this characteristic, they actually become part of God's plan. It's how God's providence works. This is, for me, it was very interesting to note this because sometimes we think that God's providence just, God can act outside of humans, our actions and our decisions, but many times God chooses to act through us, and specifically through human beings who act in harmony with his character. And this is what we see here in the book of Ruth. Naomi reveals this characteristic of God, this hesed, this loving kindness, this mercy towards others in need. And it's really, this characteristic it's like the driving force of the plot for the story. It takes the readers from death to life, from hopelessness and no future to hopeful and blossoming future. Let's move down to verse 14. So Naomi tries to persuade her daughter-in-laws to go back, and one of them does. Verse 14 says, "And they lifted up their voice and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clave unto her." This passage shows us that Naomi's daughter-in-law, they did not want to leave Naomi, which means Naomi had to be a really, really, really good mother-in-law. She was loved. She was loved. She demonstrated something of God to these Moabite women that they were even willing to, they loved her. There was genuine love back to Naomi. And I believe this kindness that she showed to her daughter-in-laws bore fruit in Ruth's action now to Naomi. Because Naomi chooses to go back. Ruth chooses to go back with Naomi. Verse 16, we read of this. It's such a powerful verse. "And Ruth said, Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whether thou goest, I will go, and whether thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God." And look at verse 17. "Where thou diest, will I die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me." This powerful commitment and evidence of what the love of God does in human hearts. This commitment to Naomi, this commitment to the people of Naomi, and this commitment to the God of Naomi. And Ruth was drawn to this. And so, going back to Naomi's experience, so the first evidence we see of God's providential leadings is that she hears that there is bread in the house of bread, that God has blessed his people and brought back the harvest. And here's the second place where we see God working in behalf of Naomi. Ruth is willing to go back with her. Ruth is willing to stick with her. Doesn't matter what. She doesn't know what the future holds for her. And she's willing to stay by her side. In the moment where Naomi is experiencing the apparent absence of God, she overlooks the love that God is showing to her through her daughter-in-law. She's overlooking the care, the loving kindness that God is manifesting to her through Ruth. Because what Ruth did was truly extraordinary. It was, again, evidence of the love of God working in her heart. And it's going to change all of Naomi's future. Because at this point in time, Naomi feels that life has just gone, life is really bad for her. So much that when she returns to Bethlehem, to her home country, and the people go out to greet her, and they're surprised. Oh, Naomi is back. The whole city, verse 19 tells us, the city was moved about them. And they said, "Is this Naomi?" What was her response? And she said unto them, "Call me not Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty hath dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord hath brought me home again empty. Why then call ye me Naomi, seeing the Lord hath testified against me, and the Almighty hath afflicted me?" Up to this point, Naomi can't see God's providence working in her behalf. She only sees all the negative things that have occurred to her and happened to her. Chapter 2. In chapter 2, we see Ruth's commitment to be a blessing to Naomi. Chapter 2, verse 2 tells us that Ruth, the Moabitess, said unto Naomi, "Let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn after him, in whose sight I shall find grace." And she said unto her, "Go, my daughters. Go, my daughter." Now, we have to keep in mind that, this was a risk for Ruth. Because if you've read the book of Judges, some places and maybe Bethlehem was one of those better towns, but some towns were really, really bad. Again, if you read that last story in the book of Judges, where this Levite stops in in one of the cities of Benjamin. The city is so bad that the men of that city are very similar, and the story has a lot of parallels with what happens when the two angels visit Lot in Sodom. Okay, this Levite goes to one of the cities of Benjamin. There's a kind old man that invites him to spend the night at his home, and the men of that city gather around that house, and they're pounding on the door, and they want to take that man and rape him. So those times were it was very dark time in Israel. And so for Ruth as a foreigner, to be willing to go out into the fields to glean, this was a risk for her. But it shows her commitment and her to Naomi, and her willingness to serve and provide for her. Ruth worked really hard, and her kindness was noted by Boaz. Chapter 2, verse 11 and 12. And Boaz answered and said unto her, It hath fully been showed me all that thou hast done unto thy mother-in-law since the death of thine husband, and how thou hast left thy father and thy mother, and the land of thy nativity, and art come unto a people which thou knewest not hithertofore. The Lord recompense thy work, and a full reward be given thee of the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings thou art come to trust. So Ruth goes out to glean, and this was a practice that had been established by God through Moses. He told, there was a certain law in place that when you went to harvest your field, you were not supposed to be so thorough that you picked every single little thing. If you were harvesting grapes, you were not supposed to harvest every single grape on the vine. In the field, same thing. You were supposed to leave some behind, and it was for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. It was God's way of providing for them. And it was interesting, God's way of providing for them. So they didn't have to plant, but they still had to get out there, and if they wanted to eat something, they still had to get out there and reap the fields. But God had made this provision, and Ruth was taking advantage of this provision that had been made. And she goes out there, and chapter 2 tells us from the morning all the way to the evening, she was working really hard, and Boaz takes note of this. And he has heard about Ruth and her faithfulness to her mother-in-law, and how she's left her family, her friends, her people, and has been willing to come back with Naomi in a very difficult situation where there wasn't much hope for her, because Naomi she was poor, she was a widow, and she didn't have anything. She didn't really have any future to offer Ruth. And it really showed that Ruth was not so much looking for her own interests, she was thinking of Naomi. And this is important because this principle is what we see operating. Naomi thinks about her daughter-in-laws and urges them to go back. She's not thinking about herself. Ruth she's not thinking about herself, she's thinking about her mother-in-law, Naomi, and says, no, I'm going to stick with you. And then Boaz now, when he sees this also moves him and encourages him to show kindness to Ruth and Naomi. And he tells his servants, hey, as you're reaping, let some of the sheaves fall on the ground and do not hinder her from picking it up. So he made her work even easier and encouraged, and even offered her water, offered her food, not just food for herself. He gave her so much food that she could take some home for Naomi, which again just shows their dire circumstance. And God is working through all this. God is working through these people who show kindness to others. Chapter 2, verse 15. And when Boaz was risen up to glean, when she was risen up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and reproach her not. And let fall also some of the handfuls of purpose for her, and leave them, that she may glean them, and rebuke her not. And so she works hard. And when she comes home, Naomi is surprised by how much barley she actually brings back. And verse 20 says, and Naomi said unto her daughter-in-law, blessed be he of the Lord, who hath not left off his kindness to the living and to the dead. And Naomi said unto her, the man is near of kin unto us, one of our next kinsmen. Now, just to understand this, in those times, there was this law put in place when there was a marriage and the husband dies without having any children, and the wife is left a widow. There was a law in place to protect, to give a future for that man that didn't have any children. And so what was supposed to happen is a brother of this man or someone close in the family, they were supposed to marry the widow, and the first son that they had together, so he was supposed to marry her, and the first son would actually carry the name of the husband that had died. It was a way so that the person's name would not be blot out their history. And so this was a practice during those times, and there was a way out of it. If someone, you can read it, I believe I think it's in Deuteronomy 24, but there was a way out of it. If a person, if a brother did not want to do that, he wasn't forced to do it, but it was kind of a bit of a shameful experience if you didn't go through with it. You would actually, everybody would, it was a kind of a public thing, and the woman would actually spit on the man's face and say, this is the man that doesn't want to raise up seed for his brother. It was very, again, we don't always understand the culture, because nowadays, I think in our time and culture, there's not so much this sense of, having children and your future. In those days, that was like, it was one of the worst things that could happen to you, is to have no children to continue your family line and bear your name. It was seen as a catastrophe. So God put things in place to extend this, and so that a person that had this situation where they died without having children, there was some provision so that their name could continue on. Anyways, in this situation, Boaz is a close relative of Elimelech, who was Naomi's husband, and so he has the responsibility to practice this law that was in place, and in this way he would serve as a protector both for Naomi and for Ruth, and now make provision for them and for their future, as well as giving seed to the family, Elimelech's family name, because him and both of his sons had passed away. Now, Boaz is not the closest family member there. There was some other family member. The Bible leaves him unnamed, but he actually chose not to go through with that. Because again, it was a sacrifice for the person, because imagine, even though it was your child, he would not extend your family name. He was extending the family name of the deceased brother or family member. So finally, if you read the whole story, because of time we won't go through it all, but Boaz ends up marrying Ruth, and they have a child together. But again, the whole story highlights how God uses in his plan, in his providence, he uses people who show kindness to others and who act out in his character. Naomi had left Bethlehem with a husband and 2 sons, and she was returning apparently only in grief and bitterness, with a profound sense of loss. But she didn't go back alone. Remember, she returned with a committed daughter-in-law. So committed that the people of Bethlehem took note of it. And in chapter 4, verse 15, I want you to notice what the people of Bethlehem say to Naomi about her daughter-in-law. Which this was a great, tremendous compliment. It just shows how much Ruth's character shined. And he shall be, let me start in verse 14. And the woman said unto Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, which hath not left thee this day without a kinsman, that his name may be famous in Israel. And he shall be unto thee a restorer of thy life, and a nourisher of thine old age, for thy daughter-in-law, which loveth thee, which is better to thee than how many? Than 7 sons hath borne him. Now, again, in those days and in those cultures, 7 sons, that was evidence that God had blessed you abundantly. That's how it was interpreted. And 7 is often also used in the Bible as a number of completion, its fullness, to be blessed with 7 sons. Wow. But the people of Bethlehem tell Naomi, you know what? This woman, Ruth, she is better to you than 7 sons. You see how everything just flipped for Naomi? What she saw as tragic in her life, what she experienced as profound loss, so much that she wants to change her name. She doesn't want people to call her Naomi anymore. She wants people to call her Mara, which means bitterness, because it was an expression of how she felt inside. And yet, even from the beginning, even when her 2 sons died, God was already working to change everything around her life for good. Do you think God wants to do the same for you today? I don't know what loss you might be experiencing. I don't know what's missing in your life. But for me, this book, it really sends this message home powerfully. You see, for me, the book of Ruth, even though it carries the name of Ruth, for me, really, it focuses on Naomi. It starts off talking about her and her family, and it ends with her. And it just shows this transformation from despair to happiness through the selfless and God-blessed acts of Ruth and Boaz. She moves from emptiness to fullness, from destitution to security and hope. The book begins with famine and death, and it ends with a return of God's blessing upon the harvest in the field and God's blessing of giving seed to Naomi through Boaz and Ruth. And again, we see God's intervention here because it tells us that Ruth had been married for 10 years, okay, to Naomi's son, and they never had any children. But in chapter 4, verse 13, it says, "So Boaz took Ruth, and she was his wife, and when he went in unto her," what does it tell us? "The Lord gave her conception, and she bare a son." So just as God returned and brought prosperity and a harvest to Bethlehem, which was in famine, God blessed the fruit of the womb of Ruth and blessed her with a son. And this son, whose name was Obed, became the grandfather of David, King David, and part of the ancestry of the Messiah, Jesus Christ himself. God was working all along. And today I'm here to tell you that the God of Naomi, the God of Ruth, he's still alive today. And he's still in the business of working through his seemingly hidden providence to change things and bring things around in our life, to restore what was lost, to mend what was broken, to bring hope and joy where there was once only pain and bitterness. God can do great things in our life. And if you want to see God's providence at work in your life, I encourage you to bring that characteristic of God into your life, that hesed, that loving kindness. We've just celebrated Thanksgiving, and you know, one of the characteristics of people who are grateful and thankful, those same people are also very kind. The more thankful and grateful you are, the more kind you are prone to be. And kindness brings us into, it's one of those things that aligns you so that God's providence can work to bring blessing and restoration in your life. And so for my appeal for you today is that you would seek to align your life, bring God's, receive God's loving kindness in your life, and be willing to share that with others. Has God been kind to you? Has he been gracious? Find someone in need to show that same kindness, that same grace. You never know. God might be working out his mysterious providence to do something wonderful through those acts of small kindness. You never know. But it pays to live out God's character in our life. And in the end, we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. If this is your desire to enter into this experience of seeing God's providence working in your life as we partake of his character, I want to invite you to sing with me our closing hymn, 537, He Leadeth Me.